So we are now recording. I have a grand total of 5 slides. You've now seen 2 of them. Here's the third one. You've been welcomed. We talked about housekeeping. I don't think that we had any. We're gonna do a discussion of don't you know who I am? And we're gonna have, following that, questions or open discussion. But the don't you know who I am really is intended as almost a panel discussion where we're all panelists asking questions and making suggestions and sharing what we know. And so I don't know that we need to have a separate questions afterwards. But if we had questions that were not related to identity management, then I guess we could save them for there. Next month, we plan to do another session on or around security, talking about all of the tools that are available to us in the Office 365 suite, whether it's the Cloud Application Security Broker or the Threat Protection or Windows Defender. And all of that is based on and hinges on knowing who the person is that's trying to access the resource. And so we thought we would start with the identity management and then talk about how that fits into the wider array of things that are available to us from Office 365. And here is the MUGUT leadership. And this is, I'm Kevin, and JR is going to be talking to us quite a bit. And I suspect the others will be to us as soon as they can get done with their day jobs. And that's it. If you're not participating, if you're not talking, go on mute. Feel free to ask your questions in chat. If you are looking to find someone that is in the Microsoft ecosphere or looking to find another gig in the Microsoft ecosphere, throw that out in chat. And as soon as I remember, I'll post the recording up on YouTube. So there is that for that. And I think I've stopped sharing. That was, I did not know that. So I was shared the slideshow, and when I hit exit to kill the slideshow, it stopped sharing. You guys probably knew that, but that was new to me. I thought, oh no, now I'm sharing my desktop, but it ended sharing, so that was good. Any questions about the agenda? Okay, with that, we'll turn the time over to the passionately excited about identity, JR, and he will lead us and guide us through some of the identity management options that are available to us using Microsoft Azure Active Directory. How did I do, JR? Did I say that right?
That was like the perfect soft pitch. That's coming in, and I'm just going to be able to hammer that one straight back out of center field.
Okay, it's all you.
Thanks. Yeah, today is an interesting discussion, and it's one that I have a habit of not shutting up about, so we'll see how we do at 52 minutes or not. I've been on this identity journey, I would say, for about 5 or 6 years overall, through 3 separate jobs, some time in the Microsoft partner space, some time over in the corporate world, and I feel like 2021 and the last half of last year are the time where it's all finally come together, where a lot of the painful or awkward elements that were in the way before have managed to be resolved at a technical level, and everything is now graceful enough and integrated enough to really tell a coherent story for how these technologies are supposed to be used. The discussion today is going to end up having probably a primary amount of content most useful to an IT administrator point of view. That would be the largest overall percentage. But there is plenty embedded in this today that is useful from a developer point of view, particularly with how to make your apps coexist with these identity challenges, and or how to cease having to code for any consideration of identity and just say, that's handled for me out here in Azure AD, which is brilliant. Never write your own identity system if you don't have to. And this will also have plenty of content that is useful from a end user point of view or a business stakeholder point of view. What will the experience be of someone being subject to these type of identity validation policies? And how can you describe to someone, it's going to be friendly, it's going to be easy, and they're going to have an okay time overall. There's not going to be too much suffering involved there. Compared to Kevin, I have 0 slides. Instead, we're going to be doing much of this just as a live discussion. I have a core set of speaker notes. We'll be sending out pieces of those included alongside the other places this is ever linked or presented, just to make sure that people get the chance to look at any URLs embedded in them. You know, you don't have to fiercely take notes yourself. You'll get a copy if you want to out of this meeting, and we'll put other pieces like the key URLs into the eventual YouTube description, or, you know, as a pinned top comment. One way or another, all that content will always go along with the video. So The two main topics I wanted to kick into today are multi-factor authentication and passwordless authentication. And it's easier to start with multi-factor authentication because an understanding of how that framework operates will make all the concepts around passwordless start to click in place a lot easier and smoother. And exactly as Kevin noted, anytime there's a question, pop it in the chat, wave a hand, interrupt me here on the voice comms. Let's keep this as interactive as possible. You know, I have the ability to fill empty airspace with the sound of my voice, but I'm not particularly enamored with that as a presentation method compared to hearing the voices of others and making sure we're addressing questions along the way. Purpose of MFA and why it matters so much to the business is to secure a particular outcome, and that is change the authentication from a single stage pass-fail submission of a secret, a pre-existing or known password, into a multi-stage event where not only previous knowledge of a secret is required, but also live validation of ownership of some additionally secured object is required prior to being able to go touch a resource. Passwords alone are exceptionally miserable. I don't think I need to spend any huge amount of time on that, but the core summary of that idea is humans are terrible at designing good passwords. They will reuse them everywhere. The corpus of known passwords out in the world now exceeds somewhere around 1.4, 1.5 billion entries as assembled from various data breaches at various companies over time. And people can be tricked very quickly into disclosing their passwords from a phishing attempt, from social engineering, from all kinds of things. So if all that remains in between a authentication challenge and access to a sensitive resource is password, that's really not good enough. And the degree to which that's not good enough is highly correlated to the number of times you as a company want to experience ransomware or your proprietary secrets getting disclosed in the lobby of your greatest competitor, or that kind of thing. Or I guess it could be correlated to how many times you want to stay up for 72 hours in a row, day after day, in some kind of a triage response. That would also be a related concept. Microsoft has built a multi-factor authentication framework into Azure Active Directory, which is their cloud identity system. And the ability to enable MFA challenges has become extremely simple compared to what this would have ever involved in the past. When, for instance, 5 or 7 years ago, you'd had to set up several external provider resources or respondent servers, and there would not be either unified registration workflow to turn on MFA for a particular account, or a unified experience for every login challenge to always look the same, for it to be consistent application to application wherever an identity is used. Good news is that's all in the past, and the experience now is really pretty smooth. So there are 3 ways that MFA is possible to enable in Azure AD, but one of them you should ignore immediately and outright. And I think this is the place where it's going to be smartest if I start doing some screen share toggles. I will toss up from time to time a particular window or set of resources coming out of my machine into instances like a developer tenant, and we can take a look at different content together. When it's not relevant, we will kick it down and out and go back to just me. Anyhow, the obsolete way to turn on multi-factor authentication is the one that dates back all the way to circa maybe 2012 or 2013. And that is per user MFA. Sadly, this is the link that you'll probably run into most quickly if you just browse off into the M365 Admin Center. This multi-factor authentication button at the top center of the active users page is exactly what you shouldn't click, effectively. It will load a URL in the domain account.activedirectory.windowsazure.com. And the visual language of this management page should pretty quickly give away that this is a very old, very aged approach to Microsoft management. This is what Office 365 management looked like circa 6 years ago, as opposed to all the layout now with dark mode and a whole different font set and a whole different semi-bladed layout of the admin area. This multi-factor authentication method is on a per-user basis, where for one or more selected accounts, you change the status from disabled to enabled to enforced as the 3 options. This is what you don't want to use. Per-user controls are officially obsolete and are not an experience of MFA that you should worry about at all. Instead, there are 2 alternatives past per-user controls, and there are a lot better alternatives. One of them is named security defaults, capital S, capital D, if you ever have to search for it. Every Azure Active Directory tenant since October 22nd of 2019 that has been newly created has security defaults turned on. Every Azure AD tenant since maybe February or March of 2020 has the ability to go turn on these security defaults if you choose to make it active for your tenant. Even if your tenant is 10 years old or 12 years old, dating all the way back to the dawn of Azure AD, it is now available to go use this feature set if you need to. The place you control security defaults being enabled or disabled is in the Azure AD Admin Center, and you go to the Tenant Properties window right here. And there's a link to manage the security defaults. And the URL for this particular management blade will be one of the things we chuck in the notes. There's a simple yes/no toggle. Do you want them on or do you want them off? The effect of turning on that toggle is what's documented here at the Microsoft Docs page for security defaults. What it will do is it will activate multi-factor authentication registration for every user in the tenant, regardless of their role, whether they're a regular user or an admin user. They will be prompted to go through the registration workflow. For every user who is a regular user account, the only allowed authentication MFA method will be the Microsoft Authenticator app on a smartphone. So that means that security defaults to be enabled does make an assumption about all of your affected users having access to some kind of an iOS or an Android device, whether company provided or personal, that can run that Authenticator app. Every admin account will be mandated to use MFA on login. So anything that is assigned a global admin role, security administrator role, user administrator, any of those high permission admin tiers won't just be required to register, they will be actively challenged on each login in real time. Legacy authentication, meaning non-modern auth that cannot interact with MFA, protocols like straight SMTP, like the POP protocol or IMAP, all of those methods will be turned off, tenant-wide. And users will be challenged to complete multi-factor authentication when their login attempt is dubbed as potentially suspicious, when it falls outside of a, say, machine learning model on Microsoft's part that says this user login attempt does not match what we would expect, either for network location or device identity or some other factor makes this unusual, raises a security flag around it, and they will be challenged to complete MFA on risky sign-ins only. The standard user experience for most sign-ins from most places that fit their common model won't require the user to complete MFA every time. So that's the experience for security defaults.
A quick question on that, if I may.
Absolutely.
Is that adaptive, or is that set at one level per different or per tenant? So if different users are coming in at different levels of security threat, is there an increased level of MFA applied depending on the level of risk which they're posing?
I would not call it adapted in any sophisticated way, Trevor. I would say the answer to that question is there's really only 2 tiers of response level. Either the user is unchallenged for MFA if they are a standard account and are accessing any resource in a way that they commonly access it in the past. Or if the user sign-in attempt is dubbed abnormal because it doesn't fit prior resource patterns, / the user is assigned an administrative role. That's a permanent assignment in terms of how they are grouped or role tagged as their Azure AD account level, then they will be challenged to complete MFA. It does not granularly respond based on sensitivity of destination with increasing the amount of authentication challenge presented to a user. So the second technology, or I guess path 3 here that we're going to talk about, is going to take care of that exact challenge.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. Here's the great news about security defaults, just to wrap it up. There's no license set required for it whatsoever. Your Azure AD tenant, even if you have just created it as a free level tenant with no licensed identities and no other features at all, can still turn on security defaults for every account permanently. That is just done and done. This is now considered the level 0 default Microsoft offering that requires no money to change hands. Just how it is, which is great. Honestly, this is exactly the type of baseline non-avoidable experience that should be baked into the way we all use IT estates and experience these products. And security defaults are a great place to start, I would say, for tenants that don't have a huge number of users embedded in them. If your organization or the organization of clients that you interact with have any reasonable user count under, 3 dozen, 4 dozen people, security defaults are almost an automatic inclusion to say, yep, kick it off, set it up, let's go. The only critical notes I would say is what you need to make sure the day you turn them on, besides, telling people to expect, hey, you'll go through some registration challenges around MFA, is if the tenant was created prior to 2017 and contains the Exchange Online service, modern authentication would have been disabled within that tenant. And you need to go enable modern authentication through sending a PowerShell command to the tenant prior to turning on the security defaults. You'll otherwise create a dependency loop where login attempts will continually hit a rechallenge and fail and rechallenge and fail, and no one will get to any of their resources. The other deal is if you use Azure AD Connect, if the identities inside Azure AD are not cloud-only identities, but are instead being synchronized with on-premise Active Directory identities, it means that one account and one account only in the tenant will be permanently excluded from using security defaults. And that is the identity assigned to Azure AD Connect for login, assuming you are using a static identity account instead of something like a OAuth token for the very latest versions of Azure AD Connect that can support a non-interactive login. But the vast majority of Azure AD Connect deployments do depend on an identity for login, and that identity will be permanently excluded from security defaults, which means do not hand that identity any permissions beyond what it needs to do for Azure AD Connect. Don't use it for any other purposes. Don't let that password get around, because it will not be able to experience MFA protection, and then we're back to square one if all of a sudden that is a widely known, highly distributed global administrator account. That'd be no good. The much more exciting way to enable MFA, the third path and the best practice implementation, is the family of technologies that Microsoft calls conditional access. Instead of turning on some global setting or per user setting that says MFA is now active in the tenant, a binary state, conditional access gives you an incredible degree of granularity and control over when MFA should be presented, how it should be presented, and under what circumstances it should be stepped up between different possible levels of authentication controls. Conditional access as a set of security policies is certainly not limited to causing MFA to be injected into the picture for a user. That same set of technologies is what lets you control geolocational limits on where people are coming into resources, or machine identity verification, making sure it's corporate-owned devices, or posture verification and health checks about the software state of a given device before it's allowed to access. In conditional access has some extreme and incredible power well beyond just identity security. It is a brilliant management technology. But today we're going to try and, not swallow the whale all at once and say, let's just look at the pieces of conditional access that allow multi-factor authentication to be inserted into a workflow. That's what's going to matter straight out. So, a couple concepts that will be relevant here. I'm going to turn back screen sharing to demonstrate them. Conditional access is controlled from within the Azure AD Admin Center again. It's not a embedded object inside the Microsoft 365 Admin Center with any particularly significant degree of fidelity. There is a way to use some conditions and controls from inside M365 Admin Center, but you don't get the full picture until you go over to Azure AD. You access it by browsing to the Security blade and then the Conditional Access tab under Protect. And this is what then brings up the sub workflow. Here is a right-hand bladed bias object, child inheriting down, to all of the areas around policies and reporting and conditions that add up to create your conditional access policies. You do require a paid license enabled to be used conditional access. The specific licensing required is something that I'm going to bring up in one tab. Yeah, that'll work. It's this list contained right here. Here at another Microsoft Docs link. We'll visit a couple dozen of those today. So, in the middle of 2020, there was a significant product renaming where Microsoft 365 as a brand started to take over more and more of what used to be called Office 365 plans. At that exact same time, there was a realignment for which license levels inside of Microsoft 365 grant permissions to use conditional access, turn on that technology for a tenant. The great news is almost every major package now embeds conditional access. If you are using or your clients are using, for instance, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, a year ago, that did not contain an entitlement to use conditional access, and now it does. And not like a stripped down version or a limited version, exactly the same. Any plan that embeds in EMS E3 or E5, which includes the frontline plans, everything named E3 and E5, all contain the ability to use conditional access. Or, if for some reason none of the license bundles get your tenant there, the minimum required license to get conditional access is Azure AD Premium P1. That can be bought in a standalone form if you have a license use case that requires just doing that. So any Azure AD P1 is the entry or gateway level to get towards conditional access. When you configure a conditional access policy, what you're doing is you're making a series of if-then declarations that say for certain input and filter conditions, so under certain circumstances, apply the following rules or decisions. And one of the conditions you can apply is grant access but require multi-factor authentication. That checkbox is exactly where you turn on a policy for MFA. My general suggestion of how to go about this is, as long as your organization has a appetite for security, and you will look at using additional technologies for quality of life like passwordless authentication, then turn on a conditional access policy where the scope is all users in your tenant. That can actually then extend to be guest users if you want it to. We'll get to that in a second. But all users in the tenant are on the input side, every service and application on the output side. So mandatory universal requirement MFA on every login attempt, and then apply that to every account except the excluded accounts that need to be left off for either some kind of process use and they haven't been replaced with a OAuth token, or the break glass admin accounts, the 1 to 2 emergency fallback accounts that if Microsoft ever has a day where their MFA service fails and falls apart, you can still use a set of credentials that are highly secured to get in and control the tenant. That's my honest advice. Make it universal. Make it be that there are at least one level of MFA required on every login attempt for every user without exceptions. Then tune up from there. For administrators, challenge for more specific or additional kinds of MFA. For login attempts made on non-corporate controlled devices, challenge for higher levels of authentication, right? Someone who's coming in as a public kiosk user, you know, if you've got an employee traveling around and they're having to borrow some other computer, someone coming in as a public kiosk user should be subject to a much higher degree of scrutiny on a non-controlled computer to use a browser version of your M365 apps than someone who has their work computer or their own direct work-controlled smartphone. Someone who wants to access a SharePoint site reserved for a highly confidential project that contains very secret files should be challenged to a higher degree than that same person if they just wanted to log into their email. Those types of conditions that make additional decisions based on either the posture of the device that are coming on in or the secrecy of the resource to be accessed are where conditional actions starts to shine. And you can say, okay, require multi-factor authentication requiring 2 separate methods to pass. Require real-time interrogation of that identity to an additional standard or degree. That's where the policy starts coming to its own. The great news is they're very simple to configure and extremely well documented. You can go turn this on with probably 30 minutes of effort or less, and you can scope the exceptions and the applications on a per user basis, on a group defined basis, all very gracefully to work exactly as you need it to. Question, Trevor.
Okay, that's all very nice. And yes, I'm familiar with all of this. What levels of subscription do you need to actually enable some of these nice features? Do you need to have the premium? Do you need to have other levels of subscription over and above the basics in your tenant?
The only required subscription element for conditional access is Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 1 or higher. You can get that as a standalone license, or it is embedded inside every Microsoft 365 Business Premium, F3, E3, and E5 policy, as well as all of the security management stuff, enterprise mobility security or compliance products universally included. So Azure ADP 1 by itself or embedded in any of these other products is what's required. Now,
okay,
Microsoft.
Sorry, I have a.
Oh yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a follow-on. Okay, so you have a group of people who've got some with E3, some with E5, E7 or G. We're in the government space, so we have the G ones. But also you have people who potentially are coming in from the outside. If you have enabled, well, I suppose with the rule-based, you'd be able to enable it in a different way, but they may not have Premier licenses. So how does that play into the charging model?
Let's go with the legal answer and the real world answer side by side, because the real world answer is the one that even Microsoft trusts on this. Microsoft's documents page acknowledges that you should take proactive responsibilities to ensure you have a license count equivalent to the number of users that will ultimately be consuming the service. That's native tenant users. You don't have to pay licenses for guest users. There is no direct or formal enforcement method in place. Microsoft is not interested in placing one into the mix by any evidence that I have seen. Now, I'm not privy to particular internal information, but it's certainly not included in any of their standard license audit scopes, which are a very well-developed and formal process. If any user in the tenant has access, or I guess the first license is injected into the tenant at Azure ADP 1 or higher, by itself or in any of the bundles, that turns on conditional access tenant-wide, and it effectively becomes possible to assign those policies towards anyone at your discretion. The model for compliance, by the way, or the model for payment for guest users, got a lot more interesting in the middle of last year. Previously, up through circa mid-2020, your count of Azure AD Premium licenses created a 1-to-5 ratio entitlement for guest or external users. For every 1 licensed user in your tenant, up to 5 external users were permitted to receive the same policy grants effectively. That went away and has been replaced by an action where you go to the Azure Active Directory portal, and you tie your Azure AD tenant to some Azure subscription, any subscription you control. It's a one-time checkmark tie. That then creates a billable relationship for something called MAUs, monthly allowed users. 50,000 MAUs is the free tier. That means 50,000 guest users can validate their identities and use any of the features of conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and anything against resources in your tenant without costing you the first cent. That's a very broad and generous free tier. You know, a ton of services and a ton of businesses won't have 50,000 unique identities accessing resources from an external point of view. Past 50,000, you will be billed for a unique user, not on a per authentication basis, just on that per user basis in the background against your Azure billable usage. And the charge to do that is something like 1/3000th of a cent per MAU if they're using Azure AD P1 features, or 1/600th of a cent for Azure AD P2 features. So that's the picture of, if you have a very large number of external users coming in, it is a billable event. Up to 50,000 of them aren't, and any single conditional access license in your tenant brings the feature online tenant-wide, and it then creates a background only contractual obligation to comply to make sure you've got the right number of licenses applied or existing in the tenant relative to the number of native users actually consuming the features.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. We're actually building a multi-tenant application for our tax base. So this is all very, very relevant information.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah, it's a lot better under the MAU model and that 50,000 people coming in than the 1-to-5 ratio and no free effective user grant at all. That would have been unpleasant to have to consider those authentication scenarios on a B2B or B2C stuff until middle last year.
It was.
Yes. I feel your pain. I feel your pain. Okay. There are only 2 topics left on my mind about multi-factor authentication. And one of them is some parallel considerations that when you turn on MFA, you really have to have these questions answered at the same time. They're not exactly going to be embedded in every single piece of Microsoft documentation you see, but they're common sense related ideas. First of those is separate your admin accounts. I think I'm done asking nicely about this time on time, you know, in different places across years. And I think it's now just like, if you have any particular pride as an IT individual, don't let any daily driver or productivity account contain an admin role. Give them a separate username. Identify that username very simply by putting a suffix like .adm or .t0 at the end of the username, and send someone off to use that by itself. They don't have to have overlapping considerations. They can use that in private browser sessions, or if they're willing to use Firefox as a primary browser inside the technology called Firefox containers to keep it separate and clean from their daily driver identity. You can even use a trick where you put something like T0 admin at the start of the display name of every one of those accounts to cause them to alphabetically be sorted differently in either the list of active users in Microsoft 365 admin panel, or from a user point of view, they're alphabetically sorted differently in search results. So, you know, if you looked up me, JR Maycock, in perpetual storage, you would get a return around, I have an admin account at T0, I have an admin account at T2 for help desk work, and you have me. But those other dedicated admin accounts don't look like me. They contain these suffix strings and prefix strings in display name and username form that tell someone really clearly, yeah, those aren't what you use to contact me. You know, you don't have to make a mistake of where you're sending an email. Second common sense consideration here is around the thing that I mentioned a few minutes ago, break glass accounts. Now, Microsoft has some extremely effective and beautiful documentation for how to create break glass accounts in context of a managed Active Directory traditional on-prem Red Forest. They are not quite up to the explicit degree of recommendation in cloud accounts. So we have to interpret the guidance as best we can across that boundary. The break glass accounts should have a username that can be, randomly generated or reasonably unguessable and is documented somewhere very well. They should not be used ever under any circumstances that is outside an emergency. And you should probably require the physical world equivalent of 2 key turns to get to them. So a very simple way, even if you have no other massive process in place, is only record the break glass account's password set, like a 15-word passphrase on paper, print 7 of the words on one sheet and 8 on the other, and lock it in 2 separate IT admins or 2 separate business stakeholders' desks or safe deposit boxes, right? Physically split up the use of the credential set so that 2 people have to take each a confirmed action in order to bring that online. Those break glass accounts are what you exclude from your conditional access policies. And if there is ever a situation where all multi-factor authentication is failing, there's a service-wide outage, you still have a backup global administrator in your tenant to log into and get people help with, so on and so forth. Last, parallel consideration. And this one is called out better in average MFA documentation. Page after page on docs will all reference this. Legacy authentication and the use of @ passwords as a bypass method are practices that need to be retired from your tenant for multi-factor authentication to be effective. Those bypass methods create ways, and they're all on a deadline being counted down anyway. In current deadline announcement is September of 2021, is where legacy authentication starts getting shut off service-wide in all of Office 365. @ passwords around the same time get turned off. And anywhere you have a conditional access policy online that applies to a user, @ passwords will be ignored for that user, even if they were allowed in the past. Conditional access overrules the ability to use them. So that then means people need to use client applications that are capable of modern authentication. No 9-year-old iPhones and Apple Mail allowed. Same story with an Android. No sketchy, custom-coded, multi-factor or non-multi-factor capable printing applications or scanner devices or stuff of that type. It echoes throughout an environment a little bit, but it's worth it. All the pieces of the technical challenge imposed by this are solvable. None of them degrade your security policy. None of them require a huge amount of money or effort under the vast majority of circumstances. You just make the jump and consider these other objects and get rid of those legacy methods entirely, which come right along with turning on MFA. That's basically everything that I would have on my mind. The only optional category I have that I would love to submit to a thumbs up, thumb down vote is whether it's worth trying to look at any specific multi-factor authentication methods that are inside or outside of what Microsoft allows. Whether it's worth investing the time into describing the specific options of what that multiple factor could be, as opposed to just saying all MFA globally.
So there are use cases where the Microsoft Authenticator app cannot be legally used. For example, if you're in a call center that falls under PCI jurisdiction, your call center agents aren't allowed to have a cell phone with them while they work. And so you'll either have to get creative with a conditional access or come up with a hardware token that they can use. And so there are places where the Authenticator app isn't available or allowed. We also find that in certain countries that are behind government-controlled firewalls, that Authenticator sometimes is not responsive through that firewall in a timely manner. And so our users have difficulty logging in. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to go outside of the Authenticator app.
Interesting. The call centers might be able, if they can track the user extensions well enough, to use an inbound phone call to an extension that user controls. Otherwise, as mentioned, that's straight into the territory of hardware security keys. Any FIDO2 compliant key can be registered as that MFA method. And they're nice and strong. All right, anyone else want to raise a hand or chime in with a thought?
So once we have MFA in place, the next step then is passwordless.
That's what I think. I think it's a great logical extension. Really leveraging the same technologies. I mean, passwordless auth requires as a prerequisite for the users to be registered for MFA. So I think it's all part of that same continuum.
And so the passwordless is you just flip the switch that says allow passwordless, or is there more to it?
There actually can be a little more to it, though there is a global enable switch, a setting in the tenant that you control whether passwordless is permitted to happen in the first place. You know, extending the authentication schema to say, yep, passwordless auth can be used by users using one of these following methods. The tenant-wide switch is turned on, and then you scope it from there with extra policy controls. There are two methods of passwordless auth currently supported in Azure AD. One of them relies upon the Microsoft Authenticator. It works by, it's actually the one I live with day to day. It's the one I'm most directly familiar with. How it works is it replaces the input of the password, the pre-existing knowledge secret, with a real-time knowledge check instead. Using the Microsoft Authenticator app, a user is presented with a push notification containing 3 possible 2-digit number codes. They need to match it against the 2-digit code shown to them in the authentication workflow. So when you go to log into an app, well, so as we can actually cause this to not be abstract, can cause this just to be a shared experience instead. So if we go to log into my standard work app, as my work identity, I'm not prompted to enter a password. I'm prompted with, amusingly, 42, life, universe, and everything, as the number to match. And over here on my smartphone in my right hand, I have an approved sign-in prompt that's come up from the Microsoft Authenticator. There are 3 2-digit pairs shown to me, only one of which matches 42 is shown on the screen. I approve the notification here on my phone. I biometrically authenticate with my fingerprint, and that's what kicks off and finishes the login flow, and now I get access to my work resources. So that number-based live challenge that relies on Microsoft Authenticator is passwordless auth method number 1, and it's really effective. And this is actually something you can use and should be using over in your consumer space on your standard Microsoft accounts. That's something you can do day-to-day for all of your Windows logins or other service logins, Xbox, whatever Hotmail calls itself now, so on and so on down the line. Second method that's allowed that doesn't rely on Microsoft Authenticator, a FIDO security key. There are several manufacturers who make them. YubiKey is probably the single largest and most publicly known, but there are alternatives from Google with Titan keys and several open source or transparent supply chain smaller player companies that make FIDO standard compliant hardware devices. You can use a registered FIDO key and its private cryptographic secrets tied to your Azure AD identity as a authentication challenge. So when you go to do the exact same workflow, entering your username as hi, welcome, get to the resources, the next step you're presented with is please insert your security key to complete authentication. On mobile devices, plenty of them are NFC enabled. If you want to turn on that technology for someone to log in on their smartphone without having to worry about port compatibility of USB-C or Lightning and what elements are passed through, though that has become a lot better and a lot more effective over time. And then on physical devices, computers and such, you're relying upon a USB bus port, or some of them do have an option for Bluetooth connectivity, though I'm not very trusting of that option myself. Bluetooth is a mildly sketchy protocol. The security keys, go ahead, Gavin.
I was going to say the one benefit to the passwordless stuff is the bad guys have gotten pretty good at figuring how to get you to do the MFA part of the login so they can get into your account. We all remember the Twitter hack of last fall, where they were taking over some well-known accounts, and it turned out to be a young kid in Florida. He accessed an MFA account by tricking the employee into telling him the number that was the challenge, right? And then, so the passwordless stuff, where it is a different workflow, I think is a little more secure, and your employees are a little less likely to get tricked through social engineering into giving up the 6-digit number that so many of the MFAs use.
Mm-hmm. There is no way to tell someone on the other end of a instant message or a voice call how to go execute that workflow on your behalf. The physical presence and ownership of that token is everything. So it raises the barrier to where, you know, someone would have to be remote controlling your computer in live real time and having your consent to work with you to complete that auth workflow. It's way less prone to theft. Yeah,
which isn't to say that there aren't people out there right now trying to figure out a way to socially hack the process. You have to be ever vigilant, but it's unusual enough that I think that it's safer.
Mm-hmm. That moves into the territory of resources and skill reserved for a pretty small number of opponents, some of whom are nation states, some of whom I guess are just really motivated. When you want to go about using passwordless, particularly with respect to FIDO keys, it's important to actually consider the browser environment in question. Total compliance with the Universal Secondary Factor UTF, or FIDO underlying standards, is growing over time, for sure. But the browser engine that is in the best place is Chromium. And that means that Google Chrome and all of Microsoft Edge, or Neo Edge, or whatever you want to call the way it's coded now, are capable of immediately and directly interacting with this type of authentication challenge without requiring any extra software components to be present. If you have a case where you need to be using alternative browsers, if you needed to make Firefox directly work with that type of security key, or older Internet Explorer 11, or that sort of stuff, extra software shims have to come into play. And that creates some reliability challenges or management hurdles. You know, if you want to move in the direction of having most people use key-based passwordless authentication, that is a strong implicit suggestion that most people's daily driver browser should be Chromium-based, whether Google Chrome Enterprise or Microsoft Edge or something coded from that same family. There are plenty of other derivatives using the same underlying engine. And it is in the Chromium code, the underlying open source code, where all this is implemented, that's received downstream by basically every forked project. It's not something closed source and proprietary to Google Chrome or to Microsoft's Edge contributions.
And we might want to mention that next month, when we start talking about all of the other security features in ATP, Defender is very well integrated into Edge and has Smart Screen and ATP and a bunch of stuff that's built into Edge, which is another good reason to use that as a browser.
Yeah. It's come a long way. Honestly, I'm a fan of Neo Edge to the point where I'm strongly considering making the switch over moment to moment as my browser.
Be brave, just do it.
But Brave's the name of that other browser.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've switched to using Edge on my newer machines just because it makes it nice to be able to sync with Office 365 and all the settings come across with it.
You can do the same thing with Firefox and Chrome. The one thing that Edge does that they don't is it does a much better job of sensing when you are browsing something that is associated with your work identity and uses your work identity credentials and is different from your home identity.
Yeah, the one thing I found as well is that with Chrome, yeah, you can sync it, but you have to have a Google account that it syncs with. Whereas with Edge, it'll sync with your Office 365 account. You don't need anything extra. You sign in with the same credentials, and it all just works.
Yep.
Backend data storage for that sync follows the Azure AD account there, which is graceful. I'd like to point out one extra benefit to passwordless auth that really does deserve consideration. Every application that you put into the identity framework using Azure AD whatsoever receives immediate protection from a passwordless auth policy. So there's all the Microsoft first-party ones, obviously, get into email or Teams or SharePoint or any of that stuff. But anything that you want to choose for single sign-on, if you're an antivirus customer consuming a management portal from Sophos or Kaspersky or WebRoot, even if you weren't using Microsoft Defender, those are all single sign-on applications. Your financial package software, that can be configured for single sign-on. And this even extends down to line of business apps that reside in more traditional places in the infrastructure that run on on-premise servers. You can use an gateway component to make it so that the authentication workflow to get to that app, the network path located to bring the user over towards the app itself, still challenges for Azure AD-based passwordless sign-on. It's a really rare overlap of two things that are normally discongruent, that are normally in strong tension: user convenience and security upgrades at the same time. Normally, greater security upgrades degrades user convenience. But in this case, not having the type of password, experiencing a wider variety of single sign-on workflows, simultaneous with getting lots of extra security protections, yeah, that's a win that anyone in IT should look for anytime you can find it. It's a rare enough event to have those two incentives line up next to each other that it's almost incredible and perfect. When you want to bring this type of passwordless stuff online, it deserves probably a more thorough testing cycle than just turning on MFA. It's very predictable what the effect and outcome will be by saying multi-factor authentication is required. For broad-based single sign-on, it's a little bit less predictable for exactly what outcome any given application might accept, and whether they are all the way up in correctly interpreting, OAuth token pass off and correctly getting the authentication workflow completed. So I do want to point out a resource that is extremely useful in order to do those testing workflows. The tenant that we've been screen sharing over here in my environment, that is not a production tenant nor an environment that I've had to pay for. That is a Microsoft development tenant. If you go to the Microsoft 365 Development Center and register for a developer account, you can then deploy a development environment tenant that Microsoft pre-configures in a templated form for you, injected with different content packages, such as like 25 pre-configured users, all with mailboxes and calendars and SharePoint apps and all the stuff, and E5 licensing levels, the full E5 security feature set, and go and use one of those persons to connect to an application that you need to know works. You can join a, for example, Hyper-V Windows Enterprise VM running on your standard work computer to that Azure AD tenant as one of those identities, and have it be subjected to all of the real-world experiences that are going to be identical policy matches for what you're going to use. The ability to do that testing in a completely separate tenant environment that has no way to harm some piece of your production, but have it be at nearly perfect fidelity, is really nice. So as part of the resources we'll include and link around is the registration pages required for Microsoft development. And that is not a paid program. That is not required doing something like getting a Visual Studio Enterprise or what used to be an MSDN subscription. Those paid programs exist and they carry many benefits and justify themselves well, but it's not required to get this type of developer access. This is a free resource, and all you're largely going to experience for it is being subscribed to a couple of developer topic newsletters that you can unsubscribe from if you want to. That'll be about it.
It comes with a fair amount of training as well.
Mm-hmm. The new Microsoft Learn Center and its consolidated video library. It's very, very good. So that's probably the best environment to be able to turn on passwordless auth and make sure you understand exactly what effect will happen to any given user class or to get to any destination application.
Good stuff. Well, we're at 5 o'clock. You've overshot the mark by 8 minutes, and you were worried you wouldn't have enough. Look at you go.
Well, I'm greedy with the amount of words I get to say.
Anything else for us?
Probably just the note that staying in the know about the changes of these technologies can sometimes be challenging. So check out the message center. You know, you can get to it directly by adding it as a card in your Microsoft 365 admin portal. So, for example, as shown here.
And I would say that if you're not an admin, that would be another good reason to go out and get yourself a free development account so that you can get that messaging there.
Yep. And you can also get your email address. So administrator accounts have their emails subscribed to these message pieces. You can also get other email addresses of non-admin accounts subscribed to it and filter by particular product categories. Each of the categories, you know, gets tagged here for this is an admin experience, this is a Teams experience, this is an Exchange Online, this is a SharePoint, so on and so on. And they do a good job of announcing in advance what changes are upcoming and when those features may roll out or what changes to the timeline of the feature rollouts are on the way. The pace at which Microsoft has been improving these technologies is absurd. Year on year, how many changes get embedded is incredible. So having a subscription-based way to stay up to date on what those changes are and how they relate to your best practices implementations is super useful.
And if you're old school like I am, there's also an RSS feed.
Absolutely is. If you want to go triple old school, there's no reason you can't parse that RSS feed right into an IRC channel.
There you go. All righty. Any questions from the peanut gallery?
I have one that's pseudo not related to this. I guess I missed the beginning. I don't know if we talked about this at the beginning where we had just kind of general chit chat or not, but I am working on a contract thing right now. It's just a small little thing, and I was doing some other work for them, SharePoint work, helping them build out a small little app, and they are having some problems with their current AD environment. From what I understand, they're trying to sync to Active Directory environments. They're using a third-party tool. I forgot the name of that third-party tool. And the accounts that are being synced from the foreign Active Directory into their I don't know, what would you call it, local Active Directory? They're both AD online, so it's not like a local thing, but is not being synced down into SharePoint properly. Like when they use the people pickers and things like that to find those accounts, it's missing a whole bunch of information, and sometimes the people are not even there properly. And I said, I told them, I said, you know, this is not my wheelhouse at all. This is not things that I typically look at, but I could poke around and see if I could stumble upon something. And they responded and said, well, do you know anybody who this is more up their wheelhouse and has a little bit more experience with that? And I said, well, I know a couple of people, but next Tuesday I'm having a meeting with a bunch of people that this is right where they belong. So I'll bring it up with them and see if any of them want to take this up. From what I understand, it is a paid gig. It's not paying super well, and it's not a ton of hours, but they would really like some help with somebody who's a lot more knowledgeable in this space than I am. Is there anybody here who'd want to swap contact information with me, and I could pass it on to them and put you in touch with a possible small little contract work opportunity?
Sounds like an interesting one, to be sure.
So JR and Josh, you guys can talk. You're both board members. You have all the contact information. If that doesn't work out, I've got some other folks we can talk to. Anybody else that's here want to throw their hat in the ring to fix this silly little problem? Look at that. We're matchmakers. Woo!
I figured this would be just the group of nerds to do that. So
that's right. At least you didn't want to talk about card games. Anything else? As I have said a couple of times, next month we are going to take a much broader look at the security tools that are available in Office 365 and Microsoft 365, things that you can do to make your tenant safer and more secure. I listen to the Steve Gibson Security Now podcast almost religiously. And about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, he was talking about the company that makes cell phones for Apple, amongst other things, Foxconn, which is a tens of billions of dollars a year corporation. They have a big factory in Mexico that got hit with ransomware, and everything in the factory got locked up, and the ransomware authors, the gang, demanded $32 million to unlock that facility, that factory. And I don't know that Fox had paid it. I don't know that they had backups where they could go in and just do a refresh, but regardless, the threat is real, and we have an obligation to do everything that we can to keep our stuff safe. And so I think this is a very timely and topical thing for us to be talking about. And it all starts with identity. So thank you, JR, for walking us through that. We'll then take step 2 next month and talk about all of the other things that we can do to try and keep the bad guys outside of our chicken coop. And as always, feel free to pass the word to your friends, your security associates, whatnot, anybody that might have interest in going through that topic with us. I will take the recording as soon as it shows up and put it up on YouTube in our channel sometime in the next calendar year. I hope to do it sooner than I have been. So we'll get that up and running. Thanks for coming, and go forth and be successful.
Thanks much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. And thanks, JR, for the presentation.
My pleasure.